Boom. We're live. ZLS 063. Lukas, welcome. How you doing, man?
Oh yeah, that's a pretty catchy little tune there.
Yeah, man.
I had to
Thank you.
get down on the get down.
Yeah. So Jeff Cross wrote that for me when he found out I was doing live streams. That's actually Cheddar, his pig. Both of the sound and the as a pig. So
I wrote
yeah.
a song once about Angular that went viral at one point.
Oh yeah? Can you sing it?
No. Just Google Roger Lucas Mischief Maker and it's pretty good.
Nice, man. We'll have to check it out afterwards. We'll send out some tweets so people can see it. But yeah,
birthday.
Yeah, man. Lukas, you want to tell everyone a little bit about who you are, how we know each other, that kind of good stuff?
Yeah, so I am Lukas Ruebbelke, a published author, Google developer expert. I contribute to stuff. I get involved with stuff. I am currently the VP of Developer Growth at Briebug, where I think I probably have the best job in the world, and that is, really to focus my time really all day long, 6.5 days a week on really creating tools and ideas and material to helping developers be better at what they do, which is truly my passion. And I really love programming. I think that it's probably one of the best, I would say, professions in the world. And I think we'll probably maybe touch on that a little bit later. I would say just as a precursor, because we kind of have a narrative arc that we want to touch.
Yeah.
At the onset that I want to say that, really any success that I've experienced in my professional career has really been predicated on the generosity and the kindness of other people. And I have some very, very close mentors that, have really put up with, I would say, years and years of me being a very mediocre programmer. Like I didn't just I'm going to program and then, 10 days later, I'm awesome. I mean, I really feel like the first 10 years I was just, I would say just a middle of the road programmer. Then at one point, like I just started to change my behavior and, things started to really kind of click. But
you're just in the cocoon, man. You're the cocoon, you becoming the butterfly.
I think I think anything, typically when I think about even, mastery, I think it takes, really 4 to 6 years of just doing a lot of really junky things and a lot of repetitious things to really create the kind of the data set that you need for pattern recognition. And you just have to do a lot of stuff before you're like, I feel like I've done this 100 times. There may be a better way to do this. And for me, that was years and years of doing Flash games and animated Flash banners. And, that's really, I would say it was kind of like, equivalent of enlisting in the army, and you just go in 4 years and you just go into a kind of a black hole and you come out and you reap the benefits of it for the rest of your life. So now I talk at conferences and I have a platform in which, really to ultimately just take everything that I've learned and really just share it back to anybody who would find it useful.
Awesome, dude. Yeah, it's super interesting to hear you talk about that. It's like the thing that came immediately to mind is like training a neural net, but just like giving our brain like enough experiences, enough data to do what it does, which is like the pattern matching, right?
Right. And so the narrative arc that we have, let's just let the cat out of the bag, is really like I want to kind of present maybe some ideas in a way that would possibly resonate with somebody who would see this and, maybe provide some insight or clarity or even a lightning bolt from heaven. It's just like, oh my gosh, like it's so clear. Is that I think one is I see this as kind of a sequence or an arc of kind of these ways of thinking about things. And really the first thing is really pattern recognition and identifying the meta patterns within programming, because intelligence is really nothing more than pattern recognition. It's being able to look at something and be like, oh, that's green. And you see something else and you're like, well, that's green. And, from the beginning of time, we've been wired to like, if I see a large cat or this large animal with teeth, like I need to run. And all of a sudden now your limbic system just kicks in to hyperdrive and You even look at like our predisposition towards sugary foods is because our body says that's energy, that's what we need to eat. And so at a very, I think, primal level, we are conditioned for pattern recognition, but being able to intentionally expose yourself to a large data set to where you start to recognize things and then streamline around those patterns. And you realize, like, I'm doing, like, I've created 5 apps. I need to create a 6th app, but I've identified the things that I'm doing over and over and over. And so now the 6th app is exponentially easier to do because I've done this 5 other times. And I know how to really kind of carry that momentum into this next project. And then from there, taking those patterns or your ability to then recognize patterns and start to look at other domains. And so I call this cross-domain pollination, is being able to say, like, I'm learning music and I've seen these concepts, but I can actually apply this over to programming, or I'm cooking. I mean, there's a reason why when you go buy a book on something, where it's like, oh, JavaScript cookbook. And you're making this kind of this thing is that, like, this is like a recipe. And so you start to think about, like, well, how is programming like cooking? And I have a really good example there. And then ultimately, how do we take the things that we've learned and then transfer them back out to other people? And so really, I think at the core, like a core conviction that I have is true mastery is the ability to transfer mastery. And so one, understanding the patterns, then pulling patterns in from across, from other domains to be more effective. And then ultimately finding a way to express it in a way that you can actually create inflection points in other people's lives where all of a sudden they're significantly more effective. And then you change their life, ergo you change, everybody that's involved. That, when you take somebody and you give them a real opportunity, then, and they have the ability to increase their livelihood, well, then their family benefits. Their kids can go to better schools, that they have better transportation, on and on and on. And so I think, at the end of the day, we should never marginalize what we do and the opportunity we have to share that and make an impact in other people's lives.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, bringing meaningful change to the society around us. It's hard to do that in one human life.
Yeah.
But if you can in your life affect 2 human lives so that you can transfer everything you've gained to them, and that continues to perpetuate, before long you've got something like at a huge scale. I think that we can really do. And inside of our profession, especially, I feel like we're all standing on the shoulders of giants. Like, none of us are writing like machine level code. Right.
Thank God. If you ever have, like, it's not fun.
Yeah. Like unrolling those for loops and stuff. It's not great. But yeah, just to have these abstractions built on top of each other, and have some of these patterns named, and books on how to recognize certain patterns and how to implement them. I definitely, one of the things that you're saying that's resonating with me, though, like you talked about, like doing the 5 projects, there's something, and just your own experience, like at a certain point you amassed enough, experience to just be like, okay, we've done this before. There's something like from that you can't get from a book, right? I wonder if you can get that from a relationship with someone else who has done it too. It feels like maybe working together with them on the same project, that could be very effective. But just talking to them, just talking with someone, that seems hard to transmit. Is that fair, do you think? Or
so it's funny because we talk about, let's imagine a circle with meta patterns, cross-domain pollination, skill transfer, is that you're really creating this self-reinforcing loop in the sense of that. And we'll talk about the apprenticeship model that, like, I'm really passionate about. But you can absolutely help a junior developer converge on the right patterns by communicating things in such a way that they're able to stay focused and they're able to arrive at the solution faster. And so I think giving people good inputs and more importantly, good feedback loops. I think feedback loops are a fundamental, in my opinion, it's the atomic building block of growth.
Yeah.
Is that you have to be able to do something measure the outcome, and then adjust your behavior, and then try it again. And so we're very familiar with this as software engineers. This is what Agile is based on. This is when you do, NG test and you run your test, or, you're running Cypress or whatever, like that's a feedback loop. And then when you do Agile, that's a feedback loop. When you do lean product development, that's a feedback loop. And then at scale, then, we have large scale feedback loops. And systems thrive, they become anti-fragile when they have the right feedback loops in place. And so a really good book around that is a book called Adapt. And I believe it's by Tim Hartford. And this is, yes. So it's Adapt, Why Success Always Starts with Failure. And it's one of my absolute favorite books. I read this maybe 7 or 8 years ago. And this is where I made the connection between, like, he's talking about feedback loops at a global scale. Like, why did communism fail? Well, because it was a closed loop system. There was no way for it to improve. Versus, democracy. And I know we kind of like, let's stay away from, the elephant in the room.
Today of all days, Lucas.
But, democracy it's an open loop system. And we are always presented with an opportunity to improve or reflect on our behavior and then try to make it better. And I realized, like, this is what we're doing when we do lean product development. So if you've ever read The Lean Startup by Eric Ries, he talks about build a little something, put it in front of somebody, get some feedback, build something else. But then I realized
that book, by the way.
It's amazing.
Startup.
But Lean Startup is fundamentally, it's feedback loops at the product level. And then I'm like, well, this is what Agile is all about. You build something for a week or 2 weeks. You get feedback from your stakeholders, and you adjust and you build something else. And I realized every time, like, I run my test at a very, very local level, that's a feedback loop. And
so can we define feedback loops here? Because I wanted to make sure, like, listeners understand too. Like so when I think of, like, running NG test, right? That's some sort of feedback I'm getting. I'm assuming like we did, like, test-driven development. Let's just go with that assumption. We've written our tests first, and we have a very quick, period where we're like, okay, let's see if this worked. 3 tests failed, but one test passed. So then you keep going, you keep progressing until you have this feedback, your green lights essentially saying, okay, everything looks good. You've developed what you set out to develop. So that's like feedback at a low level. When we talk about, like, bringing in a stakeholder, though, it sounds like this is talking about, like, we've put out a build of our project and we're trying to get some, like, do the users like it? Is that kind of what we're going for in that scenario?
So in a very simple form, a feedback loop is nothing more than taking the output of an event or a system and then using that as input to determine what you're going to do next.
Okay.
So when you look at a test, like just running unit test, is you're taking the output of your test results and then you're using that to determine, like, do I ship it? Did the build break, or yes or no? And then I need to go fix something. And so that's super valuable. Like, in the case of testing, I mean, that's like, you're on the trapeze and you've basically got a safety net underneath, because when you ask somebody, like, how do you know the software works? Well, just because it hasn't broken is not a good answer. Like, you're setting yourself up for a black swan event and it's going to be catastrophic. And so when you are doing Agile, is you're taking the output of the feedback. So basically you're putting in front of a stakeholder, they're giving you feedback. So that's the output. Then you're rolling that back into what you're going to do next is input. Lean product development. Hey, we've developed this feature. Do you like it? Yes or no? Then, so it's anytime you take an output and then you basically use it as input for how the system operates or continues to operate.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. Awesome. One of the things I loved about Lean Startup too was just having, like, measuring your feedback from your users, not by talking to them, but seeing what they actually did, right? Like, how many clicks are you getting? How much engagement are you getting? like, because people will lie if you talk to them, but data doesn't lie at the end of the day. So,
and one of the things about, I think, feedback loops that's really important is that it forces us to articulate an outcome and a criteria for success, and it forces us to instrument things in a way to even just be cognizant of what we're measuring, which is a huge step forward. Because going back to when we're talking about learning, and so loop this back to your original question, is that skill acquisition comes with intentional effort. You cannot be intentional without understanding the parameters, the criteria for success, and the outcome. And so a lot of times people are like, I'm here to do this thing. And I've seen projects just completely fail because there was no criteria for success. Therefore, there was no way to even create any kind of a feedback loop. And so purely by taking and establishing a feedback loop, that forces you to define, like, what are we actually testing? What is the criteria for success? Now, for someone learning how to program, what this does, and so when I'm working with a new developer, is that I try to engage them in very intentional and consistent practice. So typically I will have them write like 30 apps in 30 days. The reason being is that they're being very intentional in what they're trying to create, and they're getting feedback. And so you're taking this compressed timeline, or this timeline, you're compressing it down to like 30 days. If I want to learn something, even personally, is I create what I like a 10 by 10 cycle of I'm going to do 10 things in 10 days, and I'm going to get feedback on that. I think certifications are a really good form of a feedback loop. I recently just became certified on Console by HashiCorp, which is a distributed mesh system. Like, it's really, really cool stuff. But for me, that's just a way to establish, like, I know enough to continue to learn. And so I think certifications are good feedback loops. I don't think they establish expertise, but I think they establish a baseline in which you're ready to, I think, to contribute and be effective. And so it's that thing of, one, having the right feedback loops be a feedback, but then also creating the right things, ergo, like controlled, consistent exercises that you can get the right feedback on. And then continue to evolve what you're doing over time. And it's that intentional application of effort with the right feedback loops, that whereas it took me like 6 years, to become, I would say, a high mid developer, is that I've seen people do this in less than 6 months. I mean, I've actually seen somebody become very proficient in Angular in like 6 weeks. Now, granted, this is all they were doing, like all the. I mean, I basically had to say, you go home, like, you can't sleep with it. So, I mean, this person was obsessed, and I loved it.
Are they? Was this person? Were they coming in with programming experience or no? None. Wow.
None. And I don't think, and I'm not going to mention names, but this individual, he basically, he went to my church, and I hadn't met him, but he's like, hey, I want to learn how to program. I heard you do this. And I'm like, well, okay, fine. Like, I was really kind of put off. Like, I'm like, I don't know. Kind of a sloppy, kind of a funny guy.
Yeah.
And, come to find out that his dad had just kind of checked out. They lost their house. They were basically in a trailer park. His mom was working 2 jobs. And he showed up, and I said, well, what have you done? He's like, well, I've watched some videos on YouTube. And he said, it's really hard because we don't have internet in the trailer. He said, I tried to stream off my cell phone, but like, it's tough. And I'm like, okay, well, I'll tell you what, like, you're in, like, get your laptop. You can come back later this week. And he's like, no, like, my laptop's in the car. Like, we're starting right now. And so I was joking around, and because really I want people to learn, like, how to do a master detail view. So if you don't know what that is, it's the most fundamental, like, UX pattern pretty much on every application. Is you have a master list of items, whatever it is, and then you're able to select that and then see the details for that item. So the quintessential framework Hello World is a to-do list. Well, guess what a to-do list is? It's a master detail, but you have a list of to-do items. You can select it, you can edit it, you can delete it, you can add it. And so the joke that I made was, you know what? Like, you probably should be able to do like a full master detail view with NGRX, communicating with the REST API in 4 weeks. And this is, I felt like Rocket in Guardians of the Galaxy, where I'm like, and then I want you to go steal that guy's prosthetic leg. Totally kidding. And I forgot about it. Well, then like 4.5 weeks later, he comes in, he's just like, look, I totally failed, but like, I'm sorry, but I finally did it. Here it is. And I'm just like, I was totally kidding. Like 8 weeks would have been fine. And, he's now employed and they got a house, cars, his dad actually has come back. It's a cohesive family unit. And I think you take everything that I've ever done, any conference, any book that I've written. I mean, you just take all of that, all the accolades of, all the accoutrements of being famous. And I would absolutely give that all away in a second to just have an opportunity to do that one more time for one person like that, like easily. Like one of my greatest accomplishments as a human being is, being able to create a circumstance for a family to come back together. And,
absolutely.
It's that ripple effect. And you look at even like Angular. I think when Igor and Mishko created Angular, like they had no idea the impact that they were going to have in people's lives. And the joke is I've made literally hundreds of dollars doing Angular. Well, that's actually not true. I've made a lot of money doing Angular by running an agency and then, through the acquisition. But you look at even with like what Narwhal's doing with NX, like that's a major piece of, I think it really solves a lot of complexity problems. And so, Jeff and Victor being good friends of mine, they are creating tools that really impact people, not only at the technological level, but at a very personal and deep level. And I think if I could just walk away with making one point that resonates with people is that when you're building software and tooling, like never underestimate the impact that can have, because I've seen it firsthand. I've got a 6-year-old kid right now in the conference room, and he is going to be 10 times the programmer that I am. I mean, he's so good. It's almost like we don't even know how to put him on contracts. Like, how do we sell this? I mean, this kid's amazing.
Yeah.
And it's just, this is kind of that intersection of where I want to be. And it comes down to, I think, intentional application of effort with the appropriate feedback loops.
It's interesting. I want to latch on to something that you had said earlier on in your rant there. It was the criteria for success. This stood out to me because I'm pretty sure I've read about this recently in terms of military strategy. I'm curious. Did you hear this phrase first in the context of software development, or did this come from elsewhere?
So this comes from for me, really, if you've ever done any kind of a story in Agile, I think it's just something I probably just started using. I don't even know where, but okay, you're creating a story. What's the criteria for success? And I really kind of converged on it, when I started doing what I call conceptual agreements, which is kind of the first step of a proposal that you send to a client, to where it's like, before I give you a number, let's just make sure that we're on the same page. And this is where, this is the situation. This is the desired outcome. And this is how we're going to know that we've accomplished it. Here's the criteria for success. Like your application deploys in the cloud, users can register, and you list, you say, when we've met this criteria, then you will have achieved this outcome. And then typically what I do underneath of that is, and I say, this is the value to your organization. To where, let's say hypothetically is that every new customer has a lifetime value of like $2,000. And it's like, if we can create this outcome. So I think it's important at that abstraction level, at a high level, to think about outcomes over output. Is like, we need to build this page, but why? Well, because we need new customers. How many customers? And so when you focus on the business outcome, it gives you, I think, a real, I would say, a very crisp place to triangulate on and really direct your efforts. And so I would say something like, based on our conversations, if the lifetime value of this customer is $2,000 and we're able to conservatively, get 1,000 customers over the next fiscal year, then this is the value that it is, this is the value to your organization.
Yeah.
Which is $2 million.
$2 million.
Right. And so when you frame it like that and you say, this is what you want to do, but this is how we know that we've done it. This is the value that it's going to mean for your organization. Yeah. Are we in agreement?
Yeah.
Once people are like that, then it's very easy to come in and just say, here's a fair price for this, because at that point you're selling money. And so it's really that criteria for success that, like, this is how we know that we've been successful.
Right.
I don't even know why I started talking about conceptual agreements, but it just seems like the most applicable. Like, I think in the actual the agreement, I'm like, criteria for success, like heading to, and that's probably why it jumped out at me.
Yeah, makes sense. Well, the reason I mentioned the reason it stood out for me is I had recently heard this in like a military article I was reading about, like the criteria of success were never defined. I think they were talking about for the Iraq War, and that's why we kind of got into a mess in there. But yeah,
I was going to say, it sounds like you've been reading like Jocko Willink or something. He actually has a very good book on leadership.
He is an extraordinary individual.
Yes.
I really enjoyed listening to him. But yeah, the criteria for success and like sort of how that relates to agile and waterfall approaches.
Yeah.
Because like I think most of the time when you're talking about contract work, waterfall almost makes more sense because you can set out some criteria for success at the beginning. Like you said, we're out of agreement. We're going to deliver this. It's been delivered. It's like a this for that, a quid pro quo. But if you get into stuff like the lean startup, what Agile is trying to do, it's like rather than having this huge chunk of things, you're trying to break it down into what is one unit? What is one unit I can get ahead of here? And the whole idea is you define the criteria for success for that unit, but you allow things to you reevaluate at that point. Once you're done, what is my next criteria for success?
Exactly.
And that's hard because if you're signing up for a long contract, it's hard to say, okay, I don't know where this is going. If you got like a tech team on site in-house, I feel like you're much more able to do like the kind of things that the lean up startups talking about, because they're all about pivoting, right? We got to measure the things that are important. So when we can use that data to inform us, we need to pivot to something else. This is not working. Keep pivoting until we find that, what do they call it, like the local maxima to target. So,
and I think that the trick there is you are always looking for criteria for success. Because how do you know anything? You measure it, and you're back to a feedback loop. The difference is just as much that I would say the axis of evil for programming it's really, in my opinion, three things. I see this 80% of the time, if not more. The first thing is you have hidden state in a function, which creates side effects. That you have nested logic. So imagine a switch statement or an if, and you have this logic inside of this nested logic within some kind of a conditional statement. And then you have basically a violation of the single responsibility principle. And this is the one that I want to hit on, is when you look at a function and you're like, well, this does this, and the minute you say that should be a big red flag that something's broken.
Yeah.
Because you're writing coarse-grained code. And so when you're writing coarse-grained code, it's very hard to optimize at what I would say kind of the micro unit of work, the smallest possible unit of work that you can do. And so I always tell people, favor fine-grained code over coarse-grained code. How you do that is you do not break the single responsibility principle. You favor, pure immutable functions over the opposite, which is, poop emoji function. And
giant ball of mud.
Yeah. you've just seen it where it's just like, I don't even, you just look like, how do you test this statement here?
Yeah.
Or even worse is like, if I call this function with the same parameters 10 times in a row, what do I get? Well, if you have nested or hidden state in there where the output is dependent on a property or a value outside of that function, so that's what hidden state is.
Mm-hmm.
The answer is you have no idea.
Absolutely.
You could call it 10 times with the same parameters, and if that property inside that function, that hidden state is changing,
mm-hmm.
you'll never know what you're going to get.
Yeah.
And so this is where, back to fine-grained code, is that when you start to scope your thought process into fine-grained units of work, fine-grained units of success criteria, then all of a sudden things become more manageable because you can adapt, you can respond. And so this is actually like a nice segue into kind of meta patterns, really. I think that the biggest thing with new programmers that's overwhelming is programming on the onset appears very complex. And it's not because programming is complex, it's because we live in a world that's complex. And we haven't figured out how to express or model the world that we live in code.
Yeah.
And so for me, really the first 10 years of my journey as a programmer, I was just constantly confused. And I was constantly trying to add in new cool things like, if I just go read the Gang of Four Design Patterns book, like everything will make sense. And then I need to read this, and then I need to do this, and I need to learn this, and then I need to learn this new framework and, whatever. And so for me, really the solution or, the approach is like, I'm just going to keep learning more. And it's like, imagine somebody who's in martial arts and they never really master any one technique, but they just keep consuming new movements and new styles. And because they don't understand what they're doing and they haven't mastered it, they're wildly ineffective. And I would say for me is I took martial arts for 6 years and I started at 10. I finished when I was 16. And this was in Chudokan Taekwondo. And then I went and I realized like, I'm going to basically be teaching classes for the rest of my life. I'm not into this. And so I went and did Muay Thai. And after about 6 months of Muay Thai, I had reduced everything that I would ever do in a physical altercation down to about 3 or 4 moves. And it was this massive reduction of noise into, if I get in a fight, and it feels weird saying this, but like if somebody was meant to do harm to me or my family or somebody, is like, I'm not going to think about these exotic kicks that I learned. What's going to happen is, one, I'm going to look for a way to walk away from this. And if I can't do that, what's going to happen is it's going to be elbows and knees until I can immobilize the situation. Like that's it. And for programmers now, that everything that I do as a programmer can be reduced into 4 basic things. That's it. When I program, I'm doing 4 things: verbs or nouns, verbs, conditions, and iterators. That's it. Nouns. What are we doing? Well, those are objects. Everything that you do, whether you're creating just a basic object, a class, an interface, you are simply describing the world around you. Verbs. What is that? That's nothing more than a method that I basically provide this input, I get this output. These are verbs. Like this is, we have objects that do things. Conditions. Should I go or shall I stay or should I go? If I go, there will be trouble. If I stay, there will be double. Like we understand this. And then iterators is that, well, if I have more than one object, what if I need to perform an action for all of the objects? And what's funny about this, we understand this at a very intuitive level as very, very small children. And so I'm actually doing a what I call the Ninja Code Club, where my kids are homeschooled. We have anybody who wants to come on a Friday afternoon twice a month. And I have to tell them, like, you as 6 and 9-year-olds, you understand how to program. The thought exercise is that imagine we have 3 trays of donuts, a red tray, a green tray, and a blue tray. And it's a variety of donuts. I can say to any one of those kids, go to the blue tray and bring me all of the sprinkled donuts.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody would have a problem understanding what I just told them. The thing is, you can express that in code. Like you've just covered nouns, verbs, conditions, and iterators. Go to the blue tray. Well, we have trays. So you have an array of trays.
Mm-hmm.
You iterate over. If blue, that's your trace. Find. Then you now have donuts. You iterate over the donuts. If sprinkles. So now we have iterators, conditions. Then fetch. So you're basically filtering on sprinkled donuts. And this child.fetch sprinkled donuts. And we understand that this is what we are doing.
I would think of the trays as an indexed map.
Well,
I can see the iterator. It's a constant time lookup, Lucas.
Oh, come on. I mean, it still, like, you're just describing a data. It's a fancy data structure.
Yeah. That's an awesome analogy.
You can start to layer stuff, but this is where meta patterns come in.
Right.
Is that you start to pattern recognize that, like, I'm doing the same thing over and over. What's funny is there's a book called Salt, Fat, Acid, and Heat. And this is by Samin Nosrat. And it's at the same time that I came up with this nouns, verbs, conditions, iterators, I saw that she had written this book where she had reduced all of cooking to these 4 things. If you truly understand these 4 things, you understand how to cook. So she has a great series on Netflix. I love the book. And I just think it's really interesting that this is almost a perfect segue into cross-domain pollination. I don't want to rush this, but she did it in one domain and I did it in programming. Is I realized, like, everything that I do, instead of building, by recognizing, do pattern recognition and realizing there's just these fundamental meta patterns I'm doing over and over and over, that I reduced everything that I've done as an engineer into 4 things that I could express on a single piece of paper. I mean, literally it's nouns, verbs, conditions, iterators. And I would say on some level, if you have hidden state, extract that to a parameter. If you have nested logic, extract to a function. If you have single responsibility violations, extract to a function. So even the 3 worst things in programming are the 3 easiest things to fix.
Yeah.
And this is where you start to realize it, even to the point. Let me make one more example before we kind of move on.
Yeah.
If you understand how REST works, REST is conventional. You have, really create, update, delete, the different things. It's the same REST verbs. Once I write that for one model, it's going to look exactly the same for every other model that I write. And so this is where, like, NX and NGRX in a lot of the modern tooling really accelerates development. I think CLIs are so important, is that once you understand what's happening with an HTTP service, you shouldn't really have to, like, keep handwriting those over and over and over. Create a template or do something. Is that you want to look at all the things that stay the same and find a way to accelerate or automate those parts of your development, and then focus on the things that change from application to application. Well, what is that? It's the user experience.
I was going to say it's the 4 things you were about to describe.
Well, those stay the same, but from application to application. So this is kind of another meta pattern. Is what changes? Well, it's the user experience. So if we're working on a baking app, which we've done, or if we're working on, some charity app or whatever it is, the user experience changes. NGRX doesn't fundamentally change. Angular doesn't fundamentally change. NX doesn't change. The user experience and the business logic for that domain changes. And so this is like this accelerated, aggressive Pareto principle that you want to spend 95% of your time working on the 5% that changes that's specific to that application. Again, user experience and business domain logic. And this is why, even to the point, like, I would say the hardest thing that people have when they're doing NGRX is really around the effects, because this is where the business logic comes in. This is where you should generally handle this. And I would say in the effects or in the selectors, if you're doing computed real-time data. But the reason why I think people struggle with that part is because they don't understand asynchronous programming. The reason being is because they're operating from a mental model that actually is not compatible with asynchronous programming. So just to touch this real quick, we typically think of programming in terms of inputs and outputs. I may have mentioned this before, where when you call a function, you provide some input, you get some output. Until you shift your mental model from input to output to input, you are going to have the hardest time understanding asynchronous programming, data streams, and by extension, RxJS. And the reason why people have a really hard time with RxJS is because they don't understand the observable stream. The reason why they don't understand the observable stream is because their mental model is not correct. They're thinking of it in terms of inputs and outputs. When you shift that and you think about it, is there's an output. There's an initial output that happens. This is the equivalent of somebody walking over to like a hose and turning the dial. Well, now you have an initial output, something streaming. Now what you have to do is figure out what that final input is. In other words, where do I put this? Does it go in the flowers? Do I spray the dog? Do I put it in the pool? And so this is where, and I like to teach observable streams with the DOM event, because anytime you move your mouse over, you're getting a stream of DOM events.
Yeah.
All you have to do is figure out, like, I want to capture this output.
Yeah.
I need to transform it, and then I need to figure out where to input it. And this is, again, it's reducing that. Like a simple, another meta pattern is, if you're dealing with asynchronous code, especially observable streams, think of it in terms of output to input. Simple shift. But then once I got that, and this is all credit to John Lindquist from Egghead. He sent me one down one day and he just took me to school. And after about 90 minutes, the lights went on. And I realized, like, I'm thinking about programming entirely wrong. It can be reduced down to, instead of input, output, there's already output. You just need to figure out where you want to put it.
Yeah. It's interesting. So when you talk about like nouns and verbs, I think where I've explained this in the past is talking about like data and functionality, right?
Yeah.
I think there's something like an event. An event, maybe that is some form of data, but or maybe it's some cross between the two. But I think like part of the reason when I first came across NGRX, like things started really resonating, is because at its core, what NGRX is an action stream. It's an event stream. Here's the stream of everything that matters that happens inside of your application, and everything from there is just kind of reducing that stream into something else. Like the state is literally, that's why they call it a reducer. We're reducing that stream into a single object that's changing over time.
Yep.
So yeah, I hear a lot of times people talk about NGRX being too complex. I think complex is the wrong word for it. Absolutely. Because it takes what was complex and makes it super simple. The trade-off is that it's more difficult, I think.
I'm biased in the sense of, like, admittedly,
sure,
NGRX took me about 6 weeks to wrap my mind around. And this is before, this was like the Rob Wormald, like, you know, he had just basically had watched Dan Abramoff's course and was like, I'm going to do this for Angular with observables. Yeah. And so there was a lot of like, what the heck? And so what was complex for me, or what was difficult, was the mental model shift. It was very hard for me to shift my thinking. And I think that's where people really, and I'm not trying to diminish like the learning curve on this, because let me give you one example real quick that like just blew me away. I don't know if anybody here, like if you know who Jafar Hussain is. So he's a core contributor to RxJS. He's one of the most phenomenal engineers that I've ever met. And he did a lot of work on RxJS. And I remember he was at NGCon. Yeah.
Do you remember Falcon?
Yeah. Basically, it was GraphQL was the file core that could, essentially.
Yeah.
But we were walking, and I just said, like, Jaffer, like, I'm a huge fan of the work you do. Like, you're such a phenomenal programmer. How does somebody like myself, who was self-taught, taught, I'm not classically trained, I don't have a degree, how does somebody like myself, you know, start to, climb the mountain that you're at the top of? It's in so many words. I don't remember exactly what I said, but it was basically like, how do I become you?
Yeah.
And what he said was, he said, well, Lucas, I'd been programming for 10 years and I learned Lisp, and I realized I didn't know how to program at all.
Mm.
And then I just walked out into traffic and got hit by a bus. I've got nothing. Yeah. And he'd been programming, I'm certainly quite effectively, for like 10 years. And he realized that he had a paradigm shift, and he realized that he didn't really understand how to program. If you've ever tried to learn a Lisp, it's very hard.
Yeah, yeah.
I recommend going to Clojure and start there. But Lisp is hard, not because it's hard in terms of technically or mechanically it's complex. It just forces you to think in a different way. And in terms of NGRX, that most of it's actually very pedestrian, and it's very basic. Like, you look at, let's say, action objects, like those are nothing. Like, they're super simple. You look at the reducers, especially if you're using something like entity, like those are not hard to understand.
At their core, it's like exactly what you were talking about. It's just a immutable, or it's a function that takes a state, an action, returns a new state, right?
Yep. And so I think people typically wrap their minds around Redux, NGRX very quickly, in terms of, like, state flows down, events flow up. Like, if you understand component-driven architecture, you understand this.
Yeah.
Where they get messed up is, what happens when I have computed data, or I have relational data, or I have asynchronous data? Like, that to me is where, like I spent another 4 weeks trying to figure that out. And then I basically said, oh, well, this is what, I basically put a service with combined latest for computed data, and then another service to basically service like an effect. Well, then they came out with selectors and effects, and I didn't need to do that anymore.
Yeah.
But that's really where people fundamentally, I think they really have a hard time with NGRX, is it comes around, not with NGRX, but it's now, where do we put this logic, and how do we handle these things in a way that we've never done before? And that's a lot more complicated, or it forces you to be a little bit more disciplined. And I would say, like, is it hard to fold your clothes and put it into your drawers in an organized system? Is it harder to do that than just throw everything in a laundry basket? Well, yeah, it takes way more effort. But
that's a good analogy.
You reap the benefit. And so the difference is that the reason why I think NGRX is a little daunting is because people confuse repetition for convention. Where it's like, I've done this similar thing over and over, but they're not interchangeable. And if you take that piece away, it falls apart. And so it's conventional, it's not repetitious. But what you're doing is, instead of having this monolithic component, God forbid, I've seen that's the worst case, but I've seen it in services, is that you are essentially taking something, you're taking 200 lines of code and you're breaking it into 303 lines of code. And so, does it have a bigger surface area? Absolutely. But that's because you are now putting things into places. You're saying, I'm going to put my socks here, I'm going to put my pants here, I'm going to put my shirts here. Not only that, is I'm going to fold them up. I'm going to take that effort. Like, does it take a little more effort to have that discipline and apply that discipline to your code up front? No doubt.
Yeah.
Do I do it for everything? Maybe now I do, but if somebody said, you know what, I'm going to start with a facade that just has a behavior subject, I would respect that. I think that's a viable start. At the end of the day, is how are you managing complexity? How are you managing state? How are you managing control flow? And how are you managing code volume? In NGRX, in RxJS, in Bikes, I think on some level, component-driven architecture, they neatly handle complexity by that definition at a micro, meso, and macro level.
Yeah, absolutely. I was tilting my head there when you were talking about the surface area increased, because I'm not sure if that's entirely true. Just like from my own experience, I've found that when people are not using some of the tools we're talking about here, like it feels like they're building hacky machines on top of like Angular change detection a lot of the times, and this is where like the black hole of state kind of explodes, right? Like I've seen things that are expressed in 500 lines of like mutable code built on top of Angular change detection. Turn that into RxJS, turn that into NGRX, and you end up, I think, with less surface area. It's definitely more distributed, but I think it's like less overall lines of code at the end of the day. Even given like the action creators and stuff like that you have to make. So
one, use the generator for that. Like use the CLI. Secondly, and I gotta be really careful what I say here, because like there's ways I could say this that would come across as sharp or sarcastic. I think the problem is you get these individuals that beat this like, oh, you just need really a service with a subject. And I'm like I agree. You should have one service with a subject. It's called the store.
Yeah.
The thing is, you are saying you need a service with a subject. The difference is you've now created 20 stores.
Yeah.
And for certain things, I will use a behavior subject, like for like a temporal notification bus, like, yeah. No problem. But it's that trade-off of like, I'm not going to do any of the upfront work now, but then eventually, when you have, all this extra code volume because you didn't fold your clothes and put it away, and you can't find what you're looking for because, your favorite pants are under, your bed or whatever. Yeah. Then all of a sudden it's like, did you really reap the benefits of not making these design decisions up front? And then what happens is instead of stopping and saying, we need to change our thought process, typically what I see is people just transfer that onto the failure of the technology. And it's like, well, I guess we need to do React because Angular is no good.
I've heard that a lot.
It's just like, I like React. Like, oh, well, now we got to go to Vue, and now we got to go back to Angular.
Yeah.
And it's like, you know what?
Questionable decision making.
Right. It's like Angular's not bad. Your Angular's bad.
Yeah.
And React's not going to be any better because you haven't adhered to the you haven't adhered to first principles.
Right.
And it's just replicating, into these unintended consequences down the road.
Yeah.
So how much time do we have? I feel like I'm having a great time, but we're still
this is a great conversation. We got 7 minutes left before our hour is up.
Let's just go straight to the apprenticeship. Like I can come back. Yeah. We can talk about this other stuff.
Yeah. That sounds great.
So
I'm curious. Yeah. I'm curious, man. How many apprentices have you had over the years?
I think at this point I'm pushing like 15, 16.
Oh wow.
And I would say
the young man you were talking about earlier, was he your first, the one that approached you in church?
No. I would say if you go to Briebug.com and you look at the About Us page, there is a number of engineers there that I personally trained. And I would say that I don't think there's any problem with sharing this. Is if you look, so Jonathan Garvey was essentially my first apprentice, my protege.
Okay.
And he is phenomenal. And it's funny because we've had a really interesting relationship because I've had to constantly pull him out of his comfort zone. And there was one time, and again, I think I could share this. I don't think he would mind, but I was going and doing training at Fidelity Investments, like the Fidelity Investments. And I'm just like, look, this is a larger class. I need a teacher's assistant. Jonathan, you're coming with me. And I don't know if he'd ever even been on a plane at that point, but he is like, I don't want to do this. Like we're walking up to the building, and it was at like the world, like the United Nations. It was this big impressive thing, and he's just totally overwhelmed. And he's basically like throwing up in the bushes practically. Like he's just like, I'm going to be sick. And I'm like, Jonathan, like, wipe that vomit off your lips and get in here, and we're going to do this. And within like 30 minutes, I'm like, I'll be in the front, you stay in the back, answer questions, whatever. He completely, like, everybody was in love with him. Yeah. He totally, like, was super effective. Like, he was fantastic. And it was just, I'm having to like drag him in, by his ear, basically, like, you're coming in. And it's just a lot of times, with a lot of these developers, is just really saying, like, look, I know you can do this. I believe in you. Like, you have to take this leap of faith. And I think where I'll share this as well, like where I really doubled down on, like, I think what really I was put on earth to do is there was a point in time, and I'll say this, I'm kind of like, it embarrasses me a little bit, but where I really wanted to prove like I could be the best and that I could be famous. And so if you do Google Roger Lucas Mischief Maker, like to me, that was the pinnacle. Like it's an 8-minute presentation. Roger and I spent probably 140 hours working on this. It was the most complex technical talk wrapped around this super catchy pop song that we wrote. And it's all smoke and mirrors and showmanship. And at the bottom of it is like this super complex application that connects to a MIDI controller. It's music. And I remember like the place, it was on fire, walking off the stage and feeling like, I really thought that would feel better. Like I really thought like that would have felt a lot better than it does. And I'm like, yeah, I'm stoked. Everybody had a good time. But I thought that would feel different. And the next year, I basically like, I'm not way too much time to speak at NGCon. And so the next year I just wrote Joe and I said, hey, I will fly up on my own dime. Can I just help out? Whatever I can do. Like, let me just help out. And Joe's like, yeah, like you're in, like, please. And I spent the entire time basically finding speakers, shuttling them to the back, getting them mic'd up, doing the sound check. And it was the most fun I'd ever had.
Yeah.
Ever. It was the best conference. And so I realized, like,
was that because of the personal connections you were making there, or?
I had nothing to prove. I had everything, like every opportunity to serve. And this is kind of the thing is that I wouldn't hesitate to get back on stage, but at the same time is I realized like I'm not validated by being in the spotlight. I'm validated by being relevant and making a difference. And how you're relevant is by making a difference. And so this is where I really doubled down on the apprenticeship program. And I realized like, when Jonathan was able to buy a house, and so now he's married, he has a kid, lovely wife, lovely kid, like we're extremely close.
Yeah.
And I'm just like, when he bought his house, I got like misty. Like I remember like he bought the house. I was, some kind of a reference. I remember I was involved in the process a bit. And I just got like tears in my eyes. Like, and I'm like, this individual, like he was able to buy a house because of the investment I made in him.
Yeah.
And, my friend Victor, who I was talking about, that's his name, is, his life has been changed. And his cousin, who was going through a really tough time, now he's a very good Angular developer, and it just starts to ripple.
Yeah.
And so the thing is that we don't scale as human beings, but we can create frameworks around meta patterns that we can use to transfer its skill. That my goal is to create enough artifacts that if I were ever to die, it's possible. I would say there's 100% chance of probability that I will die at some point, that people could take my body of work and create an apprentice model. And so even like there's these systems that have existed for, just forever. Like you look at like in the Bible with, apostles going and planting churches, and not to use that as like a canonical reference, but that idea of that social propagation of ideas.
Yeah. Well, for thousands of years, apprentice models is how we transferred skills.
No doubt. So. And It's word of mouth. I mean, even with the storytelling, art of storytelling. And so what other industry exists where you can take somebody and give them a real opportunity to make 6 figures without incurring any student loan debt?
Yeah, that's huge.
They don't have to wait 4 years to start.
Yeah.
And the thing is, I know this because I've done it. I've taken dozens of these individuals, and they are well on their way if they're not already there. And I think really what I believe more than anything, and I'm not trying to get social commentary per se, is I think that what our society needs now more than ever is not an equal distribution of income. What we need is an equal distribution of opportunity. Is that when you give individuals, especially from underrepresented communities, a real chance or real exposure to an opportunity, that's how you level the playing field. And there is no greater platform to create an equal distribution of opportunity than technology. And so at the end of the day, if you are an engineer and you know how to program, I want to challenge you, start to think about what would it take for you to take what you know and what you do and share that with someone else in a way that they could do it. And for me, it started with, there's a person that I need some extra help. I'm willing to make that investment in this individual. Now he's one of the best programmers I know, very well on his way. He's going to do great things. And then I'm like, well, how do I do that at times 10? And then Briebug came along. They said, we are all in on what you're doing. They acquired the company.
Yeah.
And now it's like, how do we do this at scale? And this is where, like, I think, again, true mastery is the ability to transfer mastery. But this leads to true relevance. And there's nothing at all that would keep somebody, like, there's no barrier to entry for somebody to program. And so this goes back to my original statement, is all of my success has been predicated on the generosity of other people by saying, no, there's no barrier to entry. Like, come and speak at the user group, or come and help out on this project, or like, come and let's hang out. Let's talk about this.
Yeah.
And I would say as a community, what we need more than ever is for developers to adopt an open position and not a closed position, and really look for opportunities to take the things that we know that we're making. I mean, I know tons of developers that are making high 5 figures, 6 figures. That's great. But eventually you're like, is there more to life than this? And the answer is absolutely. How you do that? And I used to say one last statement, and then I'll stop. When I was in my 20s, I really, really wanted to be a cash millionaire. Where I'm like, I want to make $1 million. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But I realized in the last couple of years, I would rather take 10 people and have them make $100,000. In aggregate, I'm making $1 million. But I would rather distribute that than for me to have $1 million myself. And it was me walking off the stage and just saying, like, I really thought this would feel better. Then I just reevaluated my priorities. I'm like, that didn't feel as good as I thought it would be. It was cool. You know, you go to a conference, you're in the bubble. Like, I mean, you know, if you're with Narwhal, you kind of know what that's like. And people look up to you, rightly so. Like I would say anybody that is influential in the community, there's a reason why people listen to you. And, you know, anybody like say Narwhal, like Narwhal puts out a lot of great stuff. And I think people, you know, I think for people to respect and look up to, you know, the contributions that, you know, your team has made, it's warranted. At the same time, that it's really tempting to get pulled into kind of that bubble of like, well, maybe I am famous. And then for me, I go home and my wife's like, take the trash out. Like, that's right. I'm just
back in your place. I hear you, dude. It's so interesting to hear you talk about things this way. I feel like it's just an entirely new perspective on things I've been thinking about quite a bit. Like I'm very interested in personal finance for one. It's a weird thing to be interested in because you kind of can't like talk about it unless you're in certain social scenarios, right? But
against it, which I think is unfounded.
Yeah, there's some weird stuff around it, but like in terms of like measuring, like in terms of measuring my contribution I want to make on the world, I've never, so I don't tend to think of it in terms of like a dollar amount for salary, right? Like to me, like my interest in like personal finance is all about like hitting some threshold to say I don't need to care about that anymore. Now I can be perfectly focused on my impact. And the trick for me has always been like how do I align those two things? Because at the rate I'm going, I'm not going to be financially independent for a long time. So I don't want to just like get at the end of my life and say, okay, I finally did it. But now I have no more time left for impact. So I don't know.
Let me share a quick story with you that I think is really, I think money is important because money is options and money is stability. And I think you look at statistically, most like truly successful people, they are very generous. But so John Lindquist, who is the co-founder of Egghead, and I have so much respect for him. He is amazing. Like John, if you ever hear this, I love you. You've impacted my life in really profound ways. And we were talking one day and we're out doing a training engagement somewhere. And I just mentioned how people are so funny about value and how they perceive value. And I told John, I said, John, if you gave me the opportunity, you said, I will give you $10,000 cash, or I will give you the opportunity to spend an afternoon with me, just looking over my shoulder, talking about programming. I said, I would choose that afternoon with you every single time. No questions. 4 hours with you for an opportunity to be exposed to one good idea. I could take that and make tens of thousands of dollars versus having a single, payout of 10,000. And what's ironic about that is we were in the car heading back to the hotel, where then he basically took me to school on RxJS. And he's like, do you understand RxJS? And I'm like, yeah, sure. Like I've made HTTP calls, like, get, http.get.toPromise, like done. And he's like, okay, make a stopwatch with observable streams. And I'm like, what? And I realized like, I didn't understand anything.
Yeah.
And in 90 minutes,
RxJS is such a rabbit hole, dude, to get into. Or I think I also talk about it's like a mountain to climb in terms of understanding it.
I mean, the operators are, when you think about RxJS, like you have to separate the observable stream from the operators. Do I know all the operators? No, I know like 10. And that's pretty good. But in that 90 minutes, he fundamentally changed the way that I think about programming. Which has fundamentally changed the entire course of my career.
Yeah.
And this is where, if I look at like that one conversation, I would have to say it's worth hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Yeah.
Not only for me, but I've talked about this in public forums and people, I never knew this. And all of a sudden now through this ripple effect that I've been able to impact the way that people think about observable streams, that they're not scary, that they're not like, they are approachable, that they're actually amazing.
Yeah.
And so it's like ideas are precious and they're invaluable, and meta patterns. Like even if you think about just nouns, verbs, conditions, and iterators, like if you apply that and it helps you gain clarity, like take that idea and go make a lot of money with it. Like I tell people when I give talks, like you have my permission to take this sample application and go make money. And if you do, just tell me about it because I want to hear about it.
Yeah.
Ideas are invaluable. And this is where, for me, the more ideas that I can transfer that are helpful, the richer and I think more fulfilling that my life is, and it has nothing to do with a bank account statement or
absolutely
how many people are in a room cheering and standing ovations, and like that doesn't matter.
Being able to see, like in your case, 15 apprentices, and seeing these are these are in some way 15 lives you changed from investing in them.
But then indirectly is you take, like, let's say Jonathan with his wife and his kid. Like, I've fundamentally changed the trajectory of their life. You look at Victor and his mom, his dad, his sisters going back to college.
Yeah.
Is that, we talk about, these kind of systemic problems that we have in our society. Well, a lot of that is, for instance, like systemic racism. Like systemic racism is really hard to pin down because it doesn't exist. It is like official policy. And so anytime, like typically when I talk to a person about systemic racism, the first thing that they want to do is prove to me that they're not a racist. And it's like, you're missing the point. Like at scale, like we have to understand that it does exist due to our definition of system. What does that mean? Well, it's from a family. It's anything that is systemic, like churches, families, communities. And you have to say, like, there are biases around. And I think one of the biggest ones is really this generational kind of reverb that you get from, it's like, yeah, it's policy. It doesn't exist now, but communities are suffering from things that happened 100 years ago, 50 years ago. And so how you undo that is by creating real opportunities to create positive generational change. And so I look at, like, for instance, Jonathan and Victor and the different ones. That's exciting, but I'm really excited about what it means for their kids.
Yeah.
And I think if I were like Jeff and Victor, and even you, I mean, we're excited about Angular and NX and React and Nest and all the things that we love. But we're really excited about what it means for the people that use them. Because I've been with Jeff, we've been places and people are like, NX changed my life. But what I'm really, really excited, we're really, really excited about is, what does it mean for your kids?
Yeah.
And your partners and your family and your mom and your dad and your community. And that's where, when I just believe that better software creates better lives, is to really appreciate that you have to think about it in second and third orders of complexity. Anyways, I didn't mean to get off on this weird social.
Dude, I need to have you back sometime soon so we can talk even more about this, because this is awesome. I do have to run now too, though. So
yeah, I'm supposed to. Speaking of which, one of my developers, him and his wife, they just had their first baby.
Oh, nice.
And so my wife's like, "Look, we need to go. Like, what are you doing?" I'm like, "I'm on a podcast talking about helping people and I'm not helping you, apparently." So, anyways, Zach, you're awesome. I love talking to you. Like, I think we've just become friends in the last year, but I think you're a real kindred spirit, and I've really enjoyed it. Every time that we've had an opportunity to just share our thoughts, and in this case, our heart. And anybody that's listening, if I said something that resonated with you, you can hit me up on Twitter. I accept DMs. I try to be as available as time permits. I do like to eat, sleep, and spend time with my family. But if I said something that it didn't make sense or you thought was wildly offensive, like, well, we can talk about that. And I think there's a lot to be said about, positive conflict. I don't think I've said anything too controversial, but if I said something that resonated, let Zach know. And you can, well, if you hated the show, let Zach know. But if you loved it,
if you hated it, let Lucas know next time he's on.
Yeah,
save it for him.
Stop talking about nouns, verbs, conditions, and iterators.
It's all about the nouns, verbs, conditions, and iterators, man.
Yeah,
Lucas, thank you so much. You rock, sir.
Yep.
We'll get you back here sometime. You go to your wife. I'm going to head to my wife, and we'll keep making the world a better place through code.
All right.
Thanks,
Peace out. See you guys.